ABC General Hospital spoilers for Wednesday, April 1 reveal that, in the shadowed corridors of General Hospital, where every whispered truth seems to echo louder than a shouted lie, Willow found herself standing at the fragile edge between instinct and realization, between what she had believed and what she could no longer deny. It did not come to her as a sudden revelation, but as a quiet, unsettling shift, like a piece of reality sliding slightly out of place. There was something wrong, something deeply, almost invisibly wrong, and the moment she allowed herself to acknowledge it, the world around her seemed to tilt. The realization struck not as a conclusion, but as a question she could not unask. Someone was about to receive new orders, and those orders were coming from Sidwell. The name itself carried a weight that Willow had once tried to rationalize, to reduce into something manageable, something distant, but now it pressed against her thoughts with an urgency that refused to be ignored. Sidwell was not just a distant threat anymore, he was moving pieces again, quietly, strategically, and far too close for comfort. Willow felt the shift in the air before she could articulate it, a tightening in her chest that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with recognition. Patterns were repeating. People were acting just slightly out of character. Conversations ended too quickly. Silences lingered too long. It was all subtle, almost imperceptible, but to someone who had already been burned by secrets, it was enough. What unsettled her most was not the idea that Sidwell was giving new orders, but the terrifying possibility that someone she trusted might be the one receiving them. That thought rooted itself deep within her, refusing to be dislodged. She began to revisit every recent interaction, every glance, every hesitation she had dismissed at the time. There was a growing sense that she had missed something important, something that had been right in front of her all along. And now, as the pieces began to align, she could no longer convince herself that it was coincidence. Elsewhere, removed from Willow's emotional storm but unknowingly moving along the same dangerous trajectory, Lucas and Britt found themselves drawn into a puzzle that seemed at first to be purely medical, purely procedural. A patient's condition, a series of irregularities, a set of data that did not quite match expectations, these were things they were trained to analyze, to solve. But what began as a professional inquiry slowly transformed into something far more unsettling. The inconsistencies were not random. They followed a pattern, one that suggested interference, manipulation, intention. Britt was the first to voice what both of them were beginning to suspect, though even she chose her words carefully, as if saying it too clearly might make it real in a way they were not prepared to face. There was external influence at play. Something or someone was altering outcomes, redirecting processes, leaving just enough trace to be noticed but not enough to be easily proven. Lucas resisted at first, not because he disagreed, but because accepting that conclusion meant stepping into a territory where logic alone could not protect them. As they dug deeper, comparing records, retracing decisions, questioning assumptions they had once taken for granted, the shape of the truth began to emerge. It was not just about a single case or a single anomaly. It was a network of subtle manipulations, small changes that, when viewed in isolation, meant nothing, but when seen together, painted a picture that was impossible to ignore. Someone had been guiding events from behind the scenes, ensuring that certain outcomes occurred while others were quietly prevented. The realization hit them both with a chilling clarity. This was not accidental, it was orchestrated. And in that moment, without needing to say the name out loud, both Lucas and Britt understood who might be behind it: Sidwell. The connection was not immediate, not obvious in the way that simple truths often are, but it was there, threading through every inconsistency, every unexplained decision. It was the kind of realization that did not announce itself with certainty, but grew stronger the more it was examined. And, as much as they wanted to dismiss it, to find a more reasonable explanation, none presented itself. Back across town, Willow's unease had transformed into something sharper, more focused. She was no longer simply reacting to a feeling, she was searching for confirmation. The idea that someone close to her might be acting under Sidwell's influence gnawed at her relentlessly. It forced her to confront a possibility she had long avoided. That trust, once broken, never truly returned to what it had been. It only changed shape, becoming something more cautious, more conditional. She began to notice things she had overlooked before, a hesitation in a voice, a glance that lingered just a second too long, a question that seemed innocent but carried an undercurrent she could not quite define. None of it was enough on its own, but together, it formed a pattern that was impossible to ignore. And with each new observation, her certainty grew, not in who was involved, but in the fact that something was undeniably wrong. The emotional weight of that realization was almost as overwhelming as the danger itself, because if she was right, then the threat was not just external. It was personal. Lucas and Britt, meanwhile, reached a point where speculation was no longer enough. They needed proof. The kind of proof that could not be dismissed, that could not be explained away. And yet, the deeper they went, the more elusive that proof became. It was as if whoever was behind this had anticipated their every move, staying just out of reach, leaving behind only fragments of evidence that hinted at the truth without ever fully revealing it. It was Britt who finally acknowledged what both of them had been avoiding. They were being led. Not directly, not in any way that could be easily identified, but subtly, strategically. The clues they were finding were not just remnants of past actions. They were part of an ongoing process, a carefully constructed path designed to bring them to a specific conclusion at a specific time. And that realization changed everything, because it meant that their investigation was not just uncovering a hidden truth, it was part of the plan. As the threads began to converge, as Willow's growing suspicions aligned with the fragments Lucas and Britt were uncovering, the situation took on a new level of urgency. What had once seemed like separate concerns were now clearly connected, each piece reinforcing the others, each discovery pushing them closer to a truth that was as dangerous as it was inevitable. Someone was about to receive new orders from Sidwell, that much was certain now. The only question that remained was who, and more importantly, what those orders would set in motion. Because in a world where every secret carried in the tense, ever-shifting landscape of General Hospital, patience was never a resource that lasted long, but for Brennan, it had all but evaporated. What once had been calculated restraint, an ability to watch, to wait, to manipulate events from a distance, was now unraveling into something sharper, more volatile. And at the center of that unraveling stood Nina. No longer just a complication in his orbit, but a variable he could no longer control. That was what unsettled him most. Not her defiance, not even her unpredictability, but the growing realization that she had begun to move beyond the reach of his influence. For a man like Brennan, who thrived on control, that was not merely inconvenient, it was intolerable. Nina, for her part, had crossed a threshold she could not retreat from, though she might not fully understand it yet. What she once told herself were small compromises, necessary adjustments to survive in a world built on secrets, had quietly accumulated into something far more dangerous. She had learned too well how to navigate deception, how to hold her ground under pressure, and in doing so, she had become someone Brennan no longer recognized, or worse, someone he could no longer predict. There was a quiet strength in her now, one born not of confidence but of necessity, and it manifested in subtle ways. The refusal to answer certain questions, the way her gaze held steady just a fraction too long, the careful precision of her words. Brennan saw it all, and with each passing moment his patience thinned further. What he could not tolerate was ambiguity. He needed certainty, needed to know whether Nina was still an asset or had already become a liability. The distinction mattered, because it would determine his next move, and Brennan was not a man who hesitated when action became necessary. The problem was that Nina had learned to live in the gray areas, to operate within uncertainty without revealing her true position. That made her dangerous in a way she might not even fully grasp. She was no longer reacting to the game she was, knowingly or not, influencing it. At the same time, across Port Charles, a different kind of tension was taking shape within Laura. Her instincts, honed by years of navigating crises that blurred the line between personal and political, had begun to stir in a way she could not ignore. It was not a single piece of evidence that triggered her suspicion, but rather the accumulation of inconsistencies, small discrepancies that, when viewed together, formed a pattern that refused to be dismissed. Laura had learned long ago that truth rarely announced itself clearly. It revealed itself in fragments, in contradictions, in the spaces between what was said and what was left unsaid. And now, those spaces were growing. There was something off about the way events were unfolding, something that did not align with the explanations being offered. Decisions were being made too quickly, or not at all. People were withholding information, or worse, presenting it in ways that felt deliberately incomplete. Laura found herself revisiting conversations, replaying them in her mind, searching for the moment when something had shifted without her noticing. That was what troubled her most, the possibility that the shift had already occurred, and she was only now catching up to it. Her suspicion did not yet have a name, but it had a direction, and that direction led her closer to a truth she might not be ready to confront. Because if her instincts were correct, then the issue was not just about external threats or hidden agendas, it was about trust. It was about the possibility that someone within her circle, someone she had relied on, was not who they appeared to be. That realization carried a weight that went beyond strategy or politics. It was deeply personal. Laura had always believed that even in the most complicated situations, there was a path forward rooted in clarity, in honesty, in the willingness to face difficult truths. But what if the truth itself was something she could not easily accept? What if confirming her suspicions meant unraveling relationships she had spent years trying to protect? These were not questions she could answer lightly, and yet she knew she would not be able to ignore them for long. Back in Brennan's world, the tension between him and Nina reached a point where silence became more dangerous than confrontation. He could feel the distance between them widening, not in physical terms, but in something far more significant. There was a lack of alignment now, a subtle but unmistakable divergence in their intentions. And Brennan, who had built his entire approach on anticipating the moves of others, found himself facing a situation where anticipation was no longer enough. He needed confirmation. What made the situation even more volatile was the growing sense that Nina was not acting alone. There were too many unknowns, too many variables that did not fit neatly into the framework he had constructed. It suggested the presence of another influence, another force shaping events from behind the scenes. That possibility did not just frustrate Brennan, it threatened the very foundation of his control. For Nina, the pressure was building in ways she could no longer contain. She understood, perhaps more clearly than anyone else, the stakes of what she was involved in. She knew that every decision she made carried consequences that extended far beyond herself. And yet, she could not step back. Not now. Not when everything she had done, every compromise she had accepted, had led her to this point. To retreat would be to admit that it had all been for nothing. The conflict within her was not just about survival, it was about identity. About who she had become in the process of navigating a world where trust was a liability and truth was a weapon. She could feel the weight of that transformation, even if she could not fully articulate it. And somewhere beneath it all was a question she was not ready to face, whether she still had the ability to choose a different path. Meanwhile, Laura's investigation was beginning to take shape, moving from instinct to intention. She was no longer simply observing, she was probing, testing, applying pressure in subtle ways to see how the system would respond. And what she found only deepened her concern. The inconsistencies were not resolving themselves. If anything, they were becoming more pronounced. The possibility that her suspicions were justified forced her to confront a difficult reality. If she was right, then action would be required, and that action would not be without consequence. Laura understood better than most that truth, once exposed, could not be contained. It would ripple outward, affecting not just those directly involved, but everyone connected to them. The question was no longer whether she had a reason to be suspicious. The question was what she would do with that suspicion. Because if she chose to pursue it, to follow it to its logical conclusion, she would be setting in motion a chain of events that could not be undone. And if she chose to ignore it, to preserve the fragile balance that currently existed, she risked allowing something far more dangerous to take root. As these parallel tensions moved closer to convergence, the atmosphere in Port Charles grew increasingly charged, as if the entire city were holding its breath. Brennan's dwindling patience, Nina's quiet defiance, Laura's growing suspicion, all of it was building toward a moment of reckoning that none of them could avoid. And when that moment came, it would not be defined by who had been right or wrong, but by who was willing to act and who was prepared to face the consequences of that action.